The giant widow was locked in a cage, her spirit as imprisoned as her body. For years, she endured this torment, until one day the mountain man appeared on the horizon. Against impossible odds, he freed her from captivity. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The clang of iron chains echoed through the crisp mountain air, drawing every eye in the remote Colorado village to the town square. Townsfolk emerged from wooden storefronts and modest homes, their daily routines forgotten as the battered wooden cart creaked to a halt. The massive iron cage atop it seemed to absorb what little warmth remained in the autumn afternoon. Inside sat Mary Johnson, her enormous frame somehow appearing small against the cruel metal bars. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, the giant widow hunched her shoulders, making herself as compact as possible under the collective gaze of the villagers. Her hands, bound by heavy shackles, rested in her lap. Fingers that could easily split logs now trembled slightly. Deep lines of grief carved valleys across her face, and her eyes, the color of mountain lakes, reflected a sorrow that seemed bottomless. "The mountain spirits will punish us for bringing her here," whispered an elderly woman, clutching her shawl tighter around bony shoulders. "She's cursed," another voice added. "They say her husband withered away after their wedding night." The murmurs swelled like a gathering storm. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, both terrified and fascinated by the giant woman. Elder William Davis stepped forward, his weathered face solemn beneath his gray hair as he raised gnarled hands for silence. "The council has decided," the elder announced, voice carrying across the square. "She will be judged according to our sacred laws." Mary's gaze remained fixed on her shackled hands, dignity somehow intact despite her humiliation. A tear tracked silently down her cheek, disappearing into the rough fabric of her oversized dress. From the edge of the gathering, a solitary figure watched. John Smith stood apart from the others, as he always did. The mountain dweller's rugged face remained expressionless, though something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps. His calloused hands tightened around the worn leather strap of his hunting bag. The villagers gave John a wide berth. Years of isolation had earned him a reputation for strangeness, his rare appearances in town marked by awkward silence and hurried transactions. Rumors about his past circulated like currency. Some said tragedy had driven him to the mountains. Others whispered of shame or madness. Yet as the crowd's whispers grew more venomous, something shifted in John's stance. While others saw a monster, he recognized the pain in Mary's downcast eyes, a reflection of his own solitude. Without conscious thought, his boots began moving forward, cutting through the crowd against all common sense. The reclusive mountain man was about to change everything. John Smith's heavy boots thudded against the frozen earth, each step purposeful as he pushed through the gathered crowd. The villagers parted reluctantly, their faces etched with fear and curiosity. Whispers followed him like shadows as he approached the wooden cart where the giant woman sat imprisoned. "Stand back, Smith," Elder William Davis's voice cut through the murmurs. The white-haired elder stepped forward, his weathered face contorted with alarm. "You know nothing of what you meddle with." John ignored the warning, his eyes fixed on the massive cage. Inside, Mary Johnson sat hunched, her enormous frame somehow diminished by grief. Iron chains wrapped around her wrists, the mysterious symbols etched into the metal glinting in the weak winter sunlight. "The sacred laws are clear," William continued, his voice rising to address the crowd. "The mountain spirits have sent us this omen, this giant, as a test of our faith." Several villagers nodded in agreement, clutching protective amulets and whispering prayers. Robert Brown pushed to the front, the blacksmith's powerful arms crossed over his chest. "That creature brings nothing but misfortune," he spat. "We should take her beyond the ridge and leave her to the elements." But John had stopped listening. For the first time, his gaze locked with Mary's. What he saw wasn't the monster the village feared, but a woman, impossibly large, yes, but with eyes that reflected a desperate longing for freedom. The same longing he had felt when he'd abandoned the village years ago to live in solitude on the mountain. In that moment of connection, something shifted inside him. Without hesitation, John reached for the rusted lock securing the cage door. "Smith, I forbid this," Elder Davis shouted, his authority crumbling as panic took hold. The blacksmith lunged forward, but too late. With a strength born of conviction, John broke the lock and flung open the cage door. The sound echoed across the village square like a thunderclap. Mary blinked in disbelief as John reached for her shackles. His hands looked tiny against her massive wrists, but his determination was unwavering. The chains, which had seemed unbreakable, gave way with a sudden crack that silenced the crowd. "You've doomed us all," Robert hissed, backing away as Mary rose to her full height, towering over everyone. But John stood his ground, offering his hand to the giant widow. "You're free now," he said simply. As Mary stepped out of the cage, the collective gasp from the villagers seemed to shatter something invisible, the silence of compliance, the chains of superstition that had held the village captive for generations. In one act of defiance, John had challenged not just the elders' authority, but the very foundations of their beliefs. Chaos erupted in the village square. The moment John Smith broke the chains, pandemonium swept through the crowd like wildfire. Women clutched their children close, men shouted in outrage, and a few gasped in stunned silence at the audacity of what they were witnessing. "Stop him!" Elder William Davis bellowed, his weathered face contorted with fury. "You've doomed us all, Smith! The mountain spirits will punish every soul in this village!" John positioned himself between Mary Johnson and the advancing villagers, his shoulders squared and jaw set with determination. The blacksmith, Robert Brown, lunged forward with a heavy iron rod, but John deflected the blow with his forearm, wincing as metal struck bone. "She's not what you think," John shouted over the din. "Look at her. Does she look like a curse to you?" Mary rose to her full height, towering over everyone present. Several villagers stumbled backward, crossing themselves in terror. Yet in her eyes was not malice, but confusion and pain, the look of someone who had suffered greatly and understood little of why. "The widow brings death," Robert spat, rallying others around him. "The legends are clear. Her kind destroyed the old settlement. We must return her to the cage." Elder Davis raised his hands, commanding attention. "John Smith, you have broken our most sacred law. The council will decide your punishment. But first, we must secure the giant." "I won't let you cage her again," John replied, his voice low but carrying across the now hushed square. With surprising gentleness for her massive frame, Mary moved behind John, her shackled wrists still bearing the raw marks of captivity. She whispered something only he could hear, her voice surprisingly melodic despite its depth. Taking her hand, his own looking childlike in her enormous palm, John began backing away toward the tree line. The crowd parted instinctively, fear overriding their anger as the giant widow moved among them. "This isn't over, Smith," Robert shouted as the pair reached the edge of the forest. "You'll bring ruin to us all." Mary ducked beneath the ancient pines, moving with unexpected grace for someone of her stature. John guided her deeper into the wilderness, familiar paths leading away from the only community either of them had known. Behind them, the village erupted into heated debate. Some demanded immediate pursuit, while others whispered that perhaps the mountain man had been right to free her. Sarah Johnson, the healer, watched silently from the periphery, her eyes thoughtful as the division grew more pronounced with each passing moment. By nightfall, John and Mary had vanished completely, leaving behind a community fractured by uncertainty and fear. A village where nothing would ever be quite the same again. The wooden door of John Smith's cabin groaned under the weight of new responsibility. Perched on the snowy slopes of the Colorado mountains, the modest dwelling had never been meant to house two people, especially when one of them stood nearly twice as tall as its owner. Mary Johnson ducked her head as she stepped inside, her shoulders hunched from years of trying to appear smaller than she was. "It's not much," John muttered, suddenly self-conscious of the sparse furnishings and low ceiling beams. The giant widow surveyed the space with gentle eyes. "It's freedom," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had known the alternative. Their first night established a pattern of necessary adaptations. The sturdy pine chair John had crafted years ago protested loudly when Mary sat upon it, the legs splaying slightly outward. They both froze at the sound, then burst into nervous laughter that broke the tension like spring ice on a mountain stream. "I'll make you something stronger tomorrow," he promised, already mentally calculating the lumber he would need. Mary slept on a pallet of furs near the hearth, her feet extending almost to the door. By morning, she had already begun to carve out her place in his solitary routine. The reclusive mountain dweller watched in amazement as she swept the cabin floor with hands that could easily split logs, her movements surprisingly delicate. "You don't have to," he began. "Please," she interrupted, "let me be useful." Days passed in a dance of adjustment. Wooden bowls meant for stew became teacups in her grasp. John's spare clothing remained comically inadequate, forcing him to trade with Raina Miller for fabric that Mary stitched into garments by the firelight, her fingers surprisingly nimble despite their size. The isolation that had once been John's comfort now bred moments of awkward silence, punctuated by the occasional shared smile. Yet in this forced proximity, something unexpected blossomed. During the long winter evenings, with snow piling against the windows and wind howling through the pines, the walls around his heart began to crumble. "I left them," he confessed one night, staring into the flames. "The village needed every hand, but after my brother died, I couldn't bear their whispers. I ran away." Mary's eyes reflected the firelight as she listened. She didn't offer empty consolations, only the gift of her attention. The guilt that had gnawed at him for years found voice in the presence of someone who understood what it meant to be judged. "We are both outcasts now," she said simply, reaching across the space between them to touch his hand with surprising gentleness. In that moment, John realized that in saving her, he might have begun to save himself. Summer arrived in the Colorado village, bringing with it warmth that melted the last patches of snow and heated tempers in equal measure. The annual Solstice Festival loomed on the horizon, traditionally a time of unity and celebration, but this year it served as kindling for conflict. The village square, once a place of harmony, now buzzled with hushed arguments and pointed fingers. Robert Brown pounded his hammer against the anvil with unusual force, each strike punctuating his demands. "That giant should be back in chains where she belongs," the blacksmith declared to anyone who would listen. "Our ancestors knew the dangers of mountain spirits. We show strength by upholding tradition." His followers nodded in agreement, their faces hardened with conviction. Across the village, Sarah Johnson sorted her healing herbs with deliberate care. "Mary has harmed no one," the healer whispered to a small gathering in her hut. "I've seen gentleness in her eyes that many in this village lack." Her supporters were fewer, but growing. Those who remembered kindnesses shown by the giant widow, or who questioned the old ways. Elder William Davis found himself caught between factions, his authority challenged for perhaps the first time in decades. The village leader pored over ancient texts by candlelight, searching for guidance that seemed increasingly elusive. Meanwhile, John Smith's daily routine had transformed entirely. Dawn found him hunting in the forest. Afternoons were spent foraging for berries and roots large enough to satisfy Mary's appetite. The mountain dweller moved with purpose, aware that eyes followed his every journey to and from his cabin. "He's gone mad up there," villagers whispered as John passed with his game bag. "The curse has taken his mind. I heard she crushes boulders with her bare hands," added another, embellishing the tale. "My cousin's goat went missing last week," a farmer contributed, though the animal had simply wandered to a neighboring pasture. As twilight approached each evening, bonfires were built higher than usual, partly in preparation for the festival, partly as symbolic protection. Children who once played freely until dark were now called home earlier, their parents' eyes scanning the tree line with newfound wariness. Raina Miller, calculating as always, saw opportunity in the division. The trader quietly took inventory of curiosities that might attract outsiders should Mary become a spectacle. Yet even she felt conflicted when remembering how the giant woman had nodded respectfully during their one brief encounter. The tension built like summer heat before a thunderstorm. John knew it couldn't hold. Soon, he would need to make a choice: keep Mary hidden away forever, or help her find her rightful place among people who feared what they didn't understand. The bonfires burned brighter each night, flames of celebration and suspicion reaching toward the same sky. The ground trembled without warning, sending a cascade of boulders thundering down the mountainside. Within minutes, the main supply route connecting the Colorado village to neighboring towns was completely blocked. Livestock scattered in panic, some trapped beneath smaller rocks, their distressed cries echoing through the valley. Elder William Davis stood before the gathered villagers, his weathered face grim. "We have provisions for 2 weeks at most," he announced, his voice carrying across the anxious crowd. "Without this road, we face starvation." Panic rippled through the community. Children clung to their parents, while adults exchanged worried glances. The rockslide had severed their lifeline just as spring supplies were expected. As dawn broke the following day, gasps erupted from those gathered at the disaster site. 2 figures appeared at the edge of the massive pile of rubble: John Smith and Mary Johnson. The giant widow moved with purpose toward the largest boulders, her massive frame no longer an object of fear, but suddenly their only hope. "Stand back," John called, guiding the onlookers to a safe distance. Mary approached the first boulder, a massive stone that would have required heavy machinery to move. She positioned herself carefully, muscles tensing as her enormous hands gripped the rough surface. With a deep grunt, she lifted, shifted, and rolled the boulder aside. One after another, the obstacles yielded to her extraordinary strength. "She's clearing the path," someone whispered in awe. When Mary heard the bleating of trapped goats, she worked with even greater urgency, gently lifting debris to free the frightened animals. Her giant hands, once shackled in iron chains, now worked with surprising delicacy to comfort the injured creatures. The villagers watched in stunned silence. This woman they had feared was single-handedly saving their community from starvation. Children pointed in wonder, while the adults exchanged looks of shameful recognition. "Thank you." Sarah Johnson approached Mary first, offering water from her flask. The healer's kindness broke the tension, and others stepped forward with hesitant gratitude. Yet not everyone was swayed. Robert Brown pushed through the crowd, his blacksmith's apron still tied around his waist. "Don't you see?" he shouted, pointing accusingly at Mary. Her presence angered the mountain spirits. "This disaster is her doing." The blacksmith's words found fertile ground among those still clinging to superstition. "The rock slide happened after she arrived," someone murmured in agreement. "She's saving us now, but she brought this upon us first," Robert continued, his voice growing louder. "The giant must be returned to her cage before worse befalls us all." John stepped protectively beside Mary as the crowd's mood shifted, gratitude and suspicion battling in their expressions. The mountain man and giant widow stood together, having provided salvation but still facing fear's stubborn grip on the village. The crunch of pine needles underfoot gave way to silence as Sarah Johnson approached John's cabin. The village healer clutched her woven basket tightly, eyes darting to ensure no one had followed her through the forest. This visit could cost her standing in the community, but something about Mary Johnson's gentle demeanor had stirred her conscience. "I brought some arnica for those bruises," Sarah said softly after John welcomed her inside. Mary sat by the window, her large frame making the sturdy chair look like a child's stool. The giant woman's wrists still bore angry marks from the shackles. Mary accepted the offering with hands that could easily crush stone, yet moved with surprising delicacy. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice like distant thunder. In the corner of the cabin, a small sparrow fluttered weakly in a makeshift nest of cloth. Mary explained how she'd found it with a broken wing near the stream. As she spoke, she gently stroked the tiny creature with her fingertip. "You have a healer's touch," Sarah observed, watching how the bird responded to Mary's care. Then something caught her attention. The bruises on Mary's arms that should have taken weeks to heal were already fading to yellow. "How long have you had this gift?" the healer asks, gesturing to Mary's rapidly healing skin. The giant widow shrugged. "Always. My mother was the same." Over the following hours, Sarah shared her knowledge of mountain herbs, which roots could fight fever, which leaves could ease pain. Mary listened intently, occasionally adding insights that surprised even the experienced healer. "This one," Mary said, pointing to a sprig of purple flowers Sarah had brought, "works better when harvested under a full moon." As dusk settled over the cabin, John stoked the fire and prepared a simple meal. The three shared stories in hushed tones, their voices occasionally rising in quiet laughter. When Mary began to hum a melody in the old mountain tongue, Sarah froze, recognition washing over her face. "My grandmother used to sing that," she whispered. "How do you know it?" Mary's eyes reflected the firelight. "My people have always known the songs of these mountains." The healer's hands trembled slightly as she joined the melody, her loyalty to village law warring with the undeniable connection she felt to this gentle giant. By the time stars peppered the night sky, something fragile had taken root between them. Not quite friendship, but an alliance born of shared secrets and ancient knowledge. As Sarah prepared to leave, she pressed a small pouch of rare herbs into Mary's palm. "Come to my hut if you need more," she offered, her voice steady despite the risk. "Use the path behind the old oak." Robert Brown wiped sweat from his brow as he hammered the glowing iron with renewed intensity. The blacksmith's forge blazed hotter than usual that evening, casting ominous shadows across his weathered face. His hands trembled slightly as he carved intricate symbols into metal shards. The same mysterious markings he had noticed on Mary Johnson's chains when she first arrived in their village. "This will protect us," he muttered to himself, glancing nervously at the darkening sky outside. The mountain peaks loomed like silent judges, and Robert couldn't shake the feeling they were watching him. He had always been respected in the village. His strength and conviction, never questioned, until John brought that giant woman into their lives. By morning, villagers discovered the strange symbols appearing on rocks near their homes. Thomas Fletcher found one carved into his fence post, while the Miller children spotted another etched into the stone well. Whispers of curses spread through the community faster than wildfire. "It's her doing," Robert insisted during an impromptu gathering at his workshop. "The giant has brought this upon us." His words fell on increasingly receptive ears as neighbors exchanged fearful glances. "These marks appeared when she did. It cannot be coincidence." Meanwhile, in the modest meeting hall, Elder William Davis hunched over yellowed pages by candlelight. The village leader's fingers traced faded illustrations in ancient texts passed down through generations. His eyes widened as he found symbols matching those appearing throughout the village. "It cannot be," he whispered, adjusting his spectacles. The elder had spent decades interpreting these legends to maintain order, using stories of mountain spirits to guide the village's moral compass. Now, confronted with evidence that challenged everything, William felt the foundations of his authority crumbling. The markings weren't warnings, as Robert claimed, but something else entirely. According to the oldest texts, they represented protection, sacred signs of the mountain guardians who once watched over their ancestors during times of great peril. William closed the book and stared into the flickering flame. If these interpretations were correct, then Mary wasn't bringing danger. She might be fulfilling prophecy. The thought terrified him more than any curse. Had he misled his people all these years? Were the stories he'd used to control them actually pointing towards someone like Mary? Outside, the paranoia continued spreading. Families drew their curtains tight. Children were kept from playing in the woods, and suspicious glances followed anyone who had shown kindness to the giant widow or her protector. "The mountain spirits are sending us warnings," insisted an elderly woman, clutching a protective charm. But Elder Davis remained silent, torn between tradition and truth, wondering if the return of these symbols meant their world was about to change forever. The autumn winds swept through the Colorado mountains, turning the aspen leaves to gold and signaling the time for the village's annual weaving ritual. For generations, this ceremony had brought the community together to create textiles that would warm them through the harsh winter months. This year, however, an unusual tension hung in the air, as Mary Johnson was reluctantly invited to participate. The giant widow sat awkwardly on a reinforced bench at the edge of the gathering, her massive hands surprisingly nimble as they worked the loom. Villagers cast furtive glances her way, some still clutching protective amulets, despite weeks of her peaceful presence. John Smith stood nearby, his weathered face a mask of calm determination as he nodded encouragingly at his friend. Mary's completed tapestry was brought forward, a stunning representation of the surrounding peaks and valleys, with intricate details that seemed to capture the very essence of the land. The craftsmanship was undeniable, even to her harshest critics. Elder William Davis stepped forward, his ancient hands trembling as he examined the work. The firelight cast dramatic shadows across his deeply lined face as he conferred quietly with the other elders. Robert Brown, the blacksmith, stood with arms crossed, his disapproving scowl visible across the gathering. "This pattern," William finally announced, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "It has not been seen in our village for 4 generations." He traced a symbol woven subtly into the mountains. "This is the mark of the Widow of the Peaks, a guardian spirit who once saved our ancestors from starvation." Gasps rippled through the assembly. Children pressed closer to their parents. Raina Miller, the pragmatic trader, dropped her mug of cider. "Mary Johnson," the elder continued, his voice growing stronger, "bears the knowledge no outsider could possess. She is not our enemy, but the living embodiment of the widow from our oldest legends." The pronouncement fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of disbelief, wonder, and nascent hope through the gathering. Families who had stood united in fear now found themselves divided by this new revelation. Some nodded in dawning recognition, while others backed away in confusion. John's eyes met Mary's across the firelight, a silent understanding passing between them. Something ancient was awakening in the village, a forgotten truth that would change everything. John Smith knelt on the rough wooden floor of his cabin, fingers tracing the edge of a loose plank that had always caught his boot. The floorboard gave way with a groan, revealing a leather-bound journal nestled in the darkness beneath. He recognized it immediately. His brother's handwriting covered the yellowed pages, a ghost reaching out from the past. As the fire crackled in the hearth, John settled into his chair, the book heavy in his calloused hands. Mary sat nearby, her large frame making the sturdy furniture seem delicate, her eyes curious but patient as she watched him turn the brittle pages. "My brother knew," he whispered, voice catching. "All this time." The journal told a story forgotten by most, a sacred pact between the village and beings called the Mountain Guardians. These giants had once protected the settlement through harsh winters and devastating storms, offering strength and wisdom in exchange for respect and sanctuary. "Your people," John said, looking up at Mary with newfound understanding. "The symbols on your chains, they're not marks of imprisonment. They're the same as these." He pointed to drawings in the journal, ancient sigils representing protection and alliance. Mary's fingers trembled as they hovered over the page. "I always knew they meant something," she said softly. "My grandmother spoke of agreements broken, of trust betrayed." The journal detailed how fear had gradually poisoned the relationship. When resources grew scarce, the villagers blamed the giants instead of honoring them. What began as reverence twisted into superstition, and eventually, the guardians were hunted or driven away, all except Mary's family, who had remained hidden until her capture. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the mountain in silence. John closed the journal, a weight settling on his shoulders that had nothing to do with physical burden. "When I broke your chains," he said, "I wasn't just defying the village. I was fulfilling an ancient promise," Mary finished, her eyes glistening in the firelight. John nodded, resolve hardening within him. His act of rebellion had been something far more significant, the first step toward healing a centuries-old wound. He thought of Robert Brown's hatred, of Elder William Davis's uncertainty, of the villagers torn between tradition and truth. "I won't let them take you," he promised, reaching across the table. His hand disappeared in her gentle grasp. "Whatever comes, whatever it costs." Mary smiled, the weight of generations visible in her eyes. "Then we face it together," she said, "as it was always meant to be." Winter descended upon the Colorado village with merciless fury. Frost-bitten winds howled through the narrow valleys, forcing families to huddle around hearths that struggled to keep the biting cold at bay. Snow piled in drifts taller than doorways, isolating homes and making daily survival a battle against the elements. As supplies dwindled to concerning levels, even the most self-sufficient villagers found themselves facing difficult choices. The storage cellars, usually stocked with enough provisions to last through the season, were emptying faster than anyone had anticipated. The harsh conditions had caught even the most experienced mountain dwellers unprepared. Mary Johnson's immense strength, once feared, became the community's unexpected salvation. Her giant hands could clear snow-blocked paths in minutes that would take others hours. She hauled massive logs for firewood, carrying burdens that would normally require 3 men and a wagon. When the roof of the meeting hall began to collapse under the weight of accumulated snow, she single-handedly supported the beams while others made repairs. "Never seen anything like it," whispered an elderly woman, watching Mary stack firewood outside her home. "Perhaps we've been wrong about her all along." The turning point came when little Emma Davis, Elder William's granddaughter, fell through the ice of the partially frozen stream. Without hesitation, Mary plunged into the frigid waters, her massive frame breaking through the ice with ease. She emerged moments later, the shivering child clutched safely against her chest. "She saved my Emma," William told the gathered villagers that evening, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever she may be, she is no monster." Yet not everyone's heart thawed alongside the growing acceptance. In the dim light of the blacksmith's forge, Robert Brown stoked his resentment hotter than the coals before him. The blacksmith gathered a small faction of like-minded villagers, their whispers barely audible over the howling wind outside. "Come spring, they both go," he insisted, hammering a piece of metal with unnecessary force. "The giant and her protector have no place among decent folk. We'll drive them out when the mountain pass is clear." John Smith, aware of the growing divide, spent his days hunting what game could be found and his evenings beside Mary in his cabin. Though they rarely spoke of it, both understood that their tenuous peace with the village might not survive the winter. "They need you now," John told her one night as they shared a modest meal. But Robert won't forget, and he won't forgive. Mary nodded, her large hands gentle as she tended the fire. Then we must give them more reasons to remember kindness than fear, she replied, her voice soft but resolute in the flickering light. The first warm breezes of spring melted the snowdrifts around the Colorado village, revealing not only muddy paths, but also unwelcome visitors. 3 wagons rolled into the square one morning, carrying men with calculating eyes and leather pouches heavy with gold. They had heard whispers of the giant widow, tales that had somehow traveled beyond the mountain passes during winter. "We represent Barnum's traveling spectacle," announced their leader, a slick-haired man who jingled coins in his pocket as he spoke to Elder William Davis. "We'll pay handsomely to exhibit your giant woman." The offer sent ripples through the community. Some villagers, still struggling after the harsh winter, eyed the stranger's gold with naked hunger. Others shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the slopes where Mary Johnson had made her home with John. That evening, heated voices filled the meeting hall. Robert Brown pounded his fist on a wooden table, his blacksmith's arms tensed with conviction. "She's brought nothing but trouble," he insisted. "Let these outsiders take her off our hands and leave us with something useful instead." Sarah Johnson rose from her seat, herbs still clinging to her apron. "Have you forgotten how she carried timber when the Henderson roof collapsed? Or how she cleared the eastern path after the avalanche?" The village remained divided, with some seeing an opportunity to profit from what they still considered an oddity in their midst, while others had grown to value Mary's presence. When John Smith heard about the offer, his weathered face hardened. He had grown accustomed to the whispers behind his back, but the thought of Mary being displayed like some carnival attraction made his blood boil. That night, he told her about the strangers. "I won't be their spectacle," Mary said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear in her eyes. She stood to her full height, ducking to avoid the cabin's low-ceiling beams. "I've lived in cages before. Never again." The next morning, Mary herself appeared at the village council, her massive frame filling the doorway of the meeting hall. Gasps echoed through the room as she entered, dignified despite having to bend nearly double. "I am a person," she declared, her voice echoing off the wooden walls, "not an attraction to be gawked at for coins." Her courage silenced even her most vocal critics. John stood beside her, his hand barely reaching her elbow, yet his presence solid as the mountains themselves. "Anyone who wants to sell her will have to go through me first," he announced, eyes fixed particularly on Robert Brown. The debate raged on, with the outsiders increasing their offer daily. Meanwhile, John found himself more isolated than ever from those who had once been his neighbors, save for Sarah and a handful of others who recognized the humanity in both the giant widow and the mountain man who had dared to free her. Sarah Johnson clutched her worn leather medicine pouch as she stood before the council of elders in the dimly lit meeting hall. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady as she spoke truths she had kept hidden for weeks. "Mary Johnson has been healing our people," Sarah confessed, her eyes meeting Elder William Davis's skeptical gaze. "The herbs I've given her have multiplied under her care. Plants that wouldn't grow for me thrive when she tends them." William shifted uncomfortably in his wooden chair. "Healer, these claims are serious. You know our laws about the mountain spirits." "I know our laws better than most," Sarah replied, "but I've seen her cradle dying lambs back to health with nothing but her touch and mountain herbs. The miller's youngest would have succumbed to fever if not for her remedies." The hall filled with murmurs as villagers nodded in recognition. Thomas Miller stood up, his weathered face solemn. "My son lives because of her. Call her what you will, but that giant woman saved my boy when nothing else would." More voices joined in. Stories of livestock rescued from impossible situations, of wounds healing without scars, of children's nightmares soothed by lullabies sung in a voice that seemed to emanate from the mountains themselves. William Davis rubbed his temples, the weight of tradition battling with undeniable evidence. "The outsiders offer gold for her," he reminded them. "Our supplies run low, and winter will return before we know it." "And what of our souls?" Sarah challenged. "Would we sell a protector for profit? The same hands that braid chains can mend hearts." Outside, the traders from the city waited, their vehicles parked at the village boundary. Their offers had grown more insistent with each passing day, promises of wealth and fame if the village would surrender the giant Curiosity to their traveling exhibition. Elder Davis unrolled an ancient text, its edges frayed with age. "Our ancestors wrote of giants who guarded these mountains," he said quietly. "We assumed they were myths, stories to frighten children into obedience." "Perhaps," Sarah suggested, "we misunderstood. Perhaps they were meant to inspire courage, not fear." The council chamber fell silent as the elders exchanged troubled glances. The oldest among them, Martha Collins, who rarely spoke at gatherings, cleared her throat. "I remember my grandmother's stories," she said. "The giants were not our enemies, but our guardians. We've forgotten much in our fear." William Davis looked out the window toward John Smith's distant cabin, where Mary now lived freely. The village stood at a crossroads, clinging to fear or embracing a new understanding of their own heritage. "We will need more time," he finally announced. "The outsiders must wait for our answer." The eve of the spring fair brought a rare calm to the Colorado village. Lanterns swayed in the gentle breeze as villagers prepared stalls and decorations, their hands busy, but their minds still divided over the giant woman who lived among them. Mary Johnson sat quietly at the edge of the gathering, her large frame making her conspicuous despite her attempts to blend in. John Smith noticed her discomfort and approached with a reassuring smile. "You belong here as much as anyone," he whispered, squeezing her hand gently. As twilight settled over the mountains, Mary began to hum softly, a melody that seemed to rise and fall with the contours of the peaks themselves. The tune grew stronger, and words in an old mountain dialect flowed from her lips, a lullaby about guardian spirits watching over sleeping children. One by one, the village children noticed, drifted toward her, drawn by the haunting melody that seemed to make the very air shimmer. Little Emma, the baker's daughter, was the first to sit at Mary's feet, her eyes wide with wonder rather than fear. Elder William Davis froze mid-conversation, his weathered face transforming as recognition dawned. The song, he knew this song. His grandmother had sung it to him on cold winter nights when he was no taller than a fence post. Around him, other elders paused, their faces softening as childhood memories stirred. "That's the guardian's lullaby," whispered Sarah Johnson, the healer, clutching her herb pouch to her chest. "My mother said it was forgotten generations ago." Mary's voice filled the valley, echoing off distant cliffs. Her massive hands moved gracefully, painting pictures in the air that matched her words. Mountains that sheltered, streams that nourished, spirits that protected. The children mimicked her movements, giggling when she smiled down at them. Robert Brown watched from his forge, his hammer still in his hand. Even he couldn't deny the transformation happening before his eyes. This was no monster. This was living history. For the first time since her arrival, Mary Johnson wasn't the giant widow in a cage. She was simply one of them, her story interwoven with theirs in ways they were only beginning to understand. Robert Brown paced the length of his forge, the heat from the flames doing little to warm the chill of his growing isolation. The blacksmith slammed his hammer against the anvil, each strike punctuating his frustration. The giant woman's acceptance was spreading through the village like wildfire, and he couldn't stand for it. "John Smith has deceived you all," Robert announced to the small gathering of villagers who still shared his suspicions. "First, he brings this creature among us, and now look at what's happened. Failed crops in the south field, Miller's child with fever, the strange howling at night. These are omens, clear as day." His followers nodded, their faces tight with worry. The blacksmith wiped sweat from his brow and continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Our ancestors knew how to handle such threats. The old ways protected us for generations. We must return to them before it's too late. Word of Robert's accusations spread quickly through the Colorado village. John heard the rumors while chopping firewood, and merely shook his head, his axe biting deeper into the logs. Mary, however, felt each whisper like a physical blow. Perhaps I should leave, she suggested one evening, her large frame hunched by the cabin window. I bring only trouble. Nonsense, John replied firmly. Browns always needed someone to blame. Before you, it was me. Before me, someone else. The next morning, as if fate itself wished to intervene, a black fox appeared at the edge of the village. Children screamed and adults backed away, crossing themselves. According to mountain lore, the black fox was untouchable, a spirit animal that brought misfortune to any who disturbed it. Mary happened to be collecting water when she spotted the animal limping near the well. Without hesitation, she knelt down, her enormous frame somehow appearing gentle. The villagers watched in stunned silence as she extended her hand. "Don't touch it," Sarah Johnson called out, concern evident in her voice. "The elders say—" But Mary was already cradling the injured fox, examining its paw where a thorn had embedded deeply. With surprising delicacy for hands so large, she extracted the thorn and tore a strip from her own dress to bind the wound. The fox, instead of fleeing, nestled against her. Elder William Davis watched from the gathering crowd, his weathered face unreadable as the animal many believed untouchable trusted itself to the giant widow's care. "She heals what we fear to touch," a voice murmured from the crowd. Robert Brown pushed forward, arguments ready on his lips, but faltered at the sight. The fox, traditionally a harbinger of doom in their folklore, looked peaceful in Mary's gentle grip. Even his most loyal supporters exchanged uncertain glances. For the first time, the village collectively wondered if perhaps the legends they'd clung to had been misunderstood all along. Raina Miller approached John Smith's cabin as dusk settled over the mountains. The trader's wagon was loaded with goods from the nearest town, but her mind was heavy with something else entirely. She found John chopping wood outside, his weathered face tense with suspicion. "I need to tell you something," Raina said, her fingers nervously adjusting the leather pouch at her belt. "I've been writing letters about Mary to people in Denver." John set his axe down, eyes narrowing. "What kind of letters?" Inside the cabin, Mary Johnson ducked her head beneath the low doorframe, her presence filling the small space. The giant widow offered Raina a cup of tea with hands that could easily crush the ceramic, yet moved with delicate precision. "I thought I could make money," Raina confessed, unable to meet Mary's gaze. "Bring in tourists, collectors, maybe even a traveling show." Your story was too valuable to ignore. John's fists clenched, but Mary placed her hand gently on his shoulder. The tension in the room was palpable, broken only by the crackling of the fireplace. "But then I saw what happened with the black fox," the trader continued. "How the children stopped being afraid. How Sarah started teaching you healing instead of hiding it." She looked up at Mary. "You're changing this place, making it better." Mary's eyes reflected the firelight as she studied the woman before her. "And now, I've stopped sending letters," Raina said, "but others know. They're coming anyway." The following morning, Elder William Davis called an emergency council meeting. Villagers packed the meeting hall, whispers filling the air as Raina stood before them. "I came here 3 years ago as an outsider myself," she began, her voice stronger than she felt. "You welcomed me because I brought goods you needed. Now I'm asking you to welcome Mary, because she brings something we need even more." Robert Brown stood up from his seat. "She brings danger, outsiders who'll exploit us all." "No," Raina countered. "We bring the danger ourselves when we treat people as commodities." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of farmers, craftspeople, and families she'd traded with. "I plan to profit from Mary's story. I was wrong." The hall erupted in debate. Some nodded in agreement, while others shouted objections. Through it all, Mary stood silently at the back, her height making her visible to everyone, despite her attempt to remain unobtrusive. "Mary isn't our attraction," Raina concluded, her voice cutting through the noise. "She's our neighbor, our healer, our protector, and if we stand together, we can protect her too." The outsiders arrived at dawn, 5 men in weathered clothes with hard eyes and harder intentions. Their leader, a tall man with a carnival barker smile, stood at the edge of the village square, waving a stack of papers. "The giant woman is coming with us," he announced, voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "We have contracts with 3 major establishments back east. People will pay good money to see her." Mary Johnson stood on the porch of the meeting hall, her imposing figure casting a long shadow. John Smith positioned himself protectively in front of her, his face bruised from an earlier confrontation with Robert Brown's supporters. "She's not property," John called out, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "She's a person with rights, same as any of us." The outsider laughed. "A person? Look at her. She's a curiosity, a freak of nature. We're offering $5,000 for her. That's more than this backwater sees in a year." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some villagers glanced at their neighbors, calculating what such money could mean for their struggling community. Robert stepped forward, hammer still hanging from his belt. "The blacksmith believes she's dangerous," the outsider continued, sensing division. "Others fear her. We're solving your problem and making you rich." Elder William Davis moved slowly through the crowd, his weathered face unreadable. Sarah Johnson joined him, her healer's bag clutched tightly against her chest. "If you refuse," the outsider added, patting the rifle slung across his back, "we have other ways to persuade you." John climbed the steps of the meeting hall, turning to face his neighbors. Blood trickled from his split lip as he spoke. "I know I've been an outsider myself for years," he began, voice cracking. "But I remember when this village stood for something, when we protected our own." He gestured toward Mary. "She saved your children, healed your sick, rebuilt your homes. The legends we feared were never about monsters. They were about guardians." Mary placed her large hand gently on John's shoulder, her eyes scanning the faces below. "This isn't just about Mary," John continued. "It's about who we are, what we become if we sell a human being for profit." The outsiders shifted impatiently, hands drifting toward weapons. Elder William exchanged glances with the other elders. Decades of tradition weighed against the truth standing before them. After a long moment, he stepped forward. "The council has decided," he announced, voice stronger than it had been in years. "Mary Johnson stays. She is under our protection." The village seemed to breathe collectively as the elders formed a line in front of Mary and John, a living barrier of unity that even Robert Brown, after a moment's hesitation, joined. At dawn, the villagers gathered with determination etched on their weathered faces. They hauled logs, stones, and farm tools to create makeshift barriers at the village entrance. Elder William Davis, his voice steadier than it had been in years, recited words from the ancient texts, phrases that hadn't been spoken aloud in generations. "We stand as one with the Guardian," he declared, glancing toward Mary Johnson, who worked alongside them, moving boulders that would have required 4 men. John Smith directed the efforts, his once solitary nature transformed into leadership. "Higher on the eastern side," he called out, pointing to a vulnerable spot. The blacksmith grudgingly complied, hammering support stakes into the frozen ground. When the outsiders returned with reinforcements, men carrying ropes and chains, they found not a divided community, but a united front. Sarah approached Mary, and pressed a small pouch of herbs into her massive palm. "For courage," the healer whispered, "though I suspect you need it less than the rest of us." The confrontation was tense but brief. The outsider spokesman stepped forward, waving documents and shouting about ownership and attractions. "She belongs in a proper exhibition," he insisted. People would pay good money to see her. Robert Brown, surprisingly, was the first to respond. "She belongs here," the blacksmith said, his hammer resting on his shoulder. Though still wary of Mary, his pride in the village outweighed his fear. "We protect our own." The outsiders assessed the barriers, the determined faces, the unity that hadn't existed when they first arrived. After a tense standoff, they retreated to their vehicles. John watched from the edge of the gathering, the smile softening his weathered features. Mary caught his eye across the crowd and made her way to him, ducking beneath lanterns strung between cabins. "You're not alone anymore," she said, her voice gentle despite its depth. "Neither of us are," he replied. They stood together as equals, no longer the recluse and the captive, but partners who had shown the village its own forgotten strength. Around them, the community celebrated not just their victory over outsiders, but their rediscovery of what it meant to stand together. The mountain peaks loomed in the darkness, silent witnesses to the transformation below. A transformation that had begun with broken chains and a single act of defiance. The Colorado mountains burst into vibrant green as spring breathed new life into the valley. Elder William Davis called a solemn gathering at the meeting hall, his weathered hands trembling as he unrolled ancient parchments before the assembled villagers. Mary Johnson stood tall, literally and figuratively, as the elder traced the mysterious markings on her forearms with reverent fingers. "These symbols," William announced, his voice carrying across the hushed room, "are the same ones our ancestors carved into the foundation stones of our village." He gestured toward the intricate patterns that generations had dismissed as mere decoration. "Mary is not our prisoner or our burden. She is our guardian." The revelation rippled through the crowd. The marks on Mary's skin matched exactly those found throughout the village, on boundary stones, above doorways, and in the oldest buildings. She was the last living descendant of the mountain guardians, beings of extraordinary size and strength, who had once protected the settlement from harsh winters and natural disasters. Sarah Johnson stepped forward, clutching a leather-bound journal. "My grandmother recorded stories of the guardians," the healer explained. "They didn't disappear. They married into our families, their bloodline thinning with each generation until Mary's birth renewed their presence among us." John Smith watched from the doorway, his usual isolation softened by a tentative smile. The recluse who had once been shunned now found himself welcomed with nods and warm glances. His defiance, what many had called madness, had restored an ancient covenant between the villagers and their protectors. "The symbols were never warnings," Robert Brown admitted reluctantly, the blacksmith's previous antagonism giving way to grudging respect. "They were promises of protection." Mary's eyes glistened as she traced the markings on her skin. "My mother told me they were family crests," she said softly. "I never understood why they made others afraid." The village transformed in the weeks that followed. Children who once hid from Mary now brought her wildflowers and begged for stories. The meeting hall walls, stripped of superstitious warnings, were adorned with tapestries depicting the guardian's history. Mary's history. John found himself drawn into village life, his knowledge of mountain herbs and wildlife suddenly valued rather than viewed with suspicion. The cabin that had been his fortress of solitude became a gathering place where villagers sought Mary's counsel and John's quiet wisdom. "You're not just her defender anymore," Raina Miller observed one evening as traders and villagers shared a meal outside John's cabin. "You're our bridge to her world." John nodded, watching Mary demonstrate proper stone stacking techniques to fascinated children. "And she's our bridge to the mountains themselves," he replied, finally at peace with his place in the community. 1 year after the clang of chains echoed through the mountain village, the residents gathered in the square beneath a clear Colorado sky. The space that had once witnessed Mary Johnson's imprisonment now hosted a celebration of unity. Wildflowers adorned every corner, their colors mirroring the transformation that had swept through the community. Mary stood tall among the villagers, her imposing stature no longer a source of fear, but a symbol of protection. Beside her, John Smith's weathered face had softened, the solitude in his eyes replaced by quiet contentment. Their hands occasionally brushed against each other's, a subtle reminder of the bond that had changed everything. Elder William Davis approached the pair with a ceremonial cloth embroidered with the same symbols once etched on Mary's chains. "These marks," he announced to the crowd, "were never warnings, but blessings. Our ancestors knew what we forgot, that the mountain guardians were our protectors, not our enemies." The healer, Sarah, smiled knowingly from the edge of the gathering. She had witnessed Mary's gentle healing touch transform countless lives throughout the seasons, confirming what she had suspected all along. Mary's heritage was woven into the village's oldest stories. Even Robert Brown stood among the crowd, his former resentment tempered by grudging respect. The blacksmith's tools now crafted symbols of protection rather than fear, his talents redirected towards strengthening rather than dividing the community. "A year ago, I broke chains," John addressed the villagers, his voice carrying across the square. "But Mary broke something stronger, the chains of our minds." Mary stepped forward, her voice soft yet reaching every ear. "I found more than freedom here," she said. "I found home." Children who once hid from her shadow now played at her feet, weaving flower crowns large enough to fit her head. The mountain peaks loomed in the distance, silent witnesses to the village's evolution. Raina Miller, the trader who had once seen Mary as an opportunity for profit, presented her with a journal bound in leather. "For your story," she explained, "so future generations remember." As twilight descended, lanterns illuminated the square. The villagers joined hands in a circle around Mary and John, singing mountain songs in the ancient tongue that had nearly been forgotten. Their voices carried up the slopes, echoing through valleys where legends were born. The tale of the giant widow and the mountain man became the village's most treasured story. Not one of monsters and heroes, but of courage that defied expectation and compassion that overcame fear. In breaking iron chains, they had forged bonds stronger than any metal, connecting past to present and weaving their legacy into the very soul of the mountains.